Kenny here with Gardening Simplified. Today we're going to talk about freeze dryers, how they work, and are they worth the price? Now, freeze dryers are not a cheap proposition. Now, this is a harvest right. These are the machines that I use. And a lot of times people say, I just can't justify the price. And to that I say, for long-term food preservation, how can you not justify the price on it as far as for your food and for your health? Now, if you're buying grocery store produce and stuff like that and you're trying to freeze dry it, yes, I can say, how can you justify the price? As far as the chemicals that's in it, that's used on it, that's sprayed on it, different things like that. And these chemicals are in your food. But as far as when you grow your own and you're growing organically, you're not using all these pesticides, you're growing more of your heirloom or open pollinator varieties that are more nutrient dense, and you want to keep them because I don't know anybody, or there's very few people that can grow year round. We do grow year round with on certain things we can grow during the winter time, but a lot of these things are only summertime available, so we want to preserve them so they'll be around a while. And I want to explain a little bit how a freeze dryer works. Now, this is a harvest right, but all freeze dryers work the same. Now, there are some things that I'll show you that's specific to the harvest right because I don't have other models. But what you have is a machine that freezes and pulls a vacuum on your food. And through this process, we'll talk about what goes on. Now, you do have this vacuum chamber, and it has cooling coils around the edge of it that freezes the inside of here. You have this tray assembly, and they can vary. This is a large unit, but this is an older one with 5 trays. Now, they do make an insert that's 6 trays, which if that's what you want, that's fine. I like this one because a lot of things that I dry, like herbs and stuff, I can stack the trays higher. I can actually dry more in this 5 tray than I can in a 6 tray because you have to have a certain amount of space between the top of your tray and what you're drying. And so with the newer one, this gap is smaller because the size of the chamber is the same, but you have 6 trays. So each one of these trays, you have to have a little bit more of a gap between. So it does drop the volume of what you can freeze dry in here. Now, it's recommended on a lot of things, don't fill above the tray. Well, on previous model and with the firmware that they have, or that's the software that's in here, if you had a oversized load that was above the trays, which it could still dry, it could heat and dry it out fine, it would go through a cycle and it would say that it's taken too long to do this. So that was the way it's set up. This newer model in the firmware that's in it, it doesn't do that when I have a lot of stuff in here. But anyway, what it does is it'll go through a cycle as far as cooling down. Now, this cycle can be customized on the harvest right. By hitting this customize button, it'll take you to a program here, and we'll go through each one of these things that's set here. Now, initial freeze, and most of these are set up at the factory settings. The initial freeze, it's going to get to -10, and it's going to, once it gets to -10, it's going to run an extra hour of freezing before it starts its vacuum stage. This, you have dry mode, you have fast dry mode here. You could slow it down, but on this dry temperature, this is the temperature that the sensor is going to pick up, and it's going to heat these trays. Underneath each one of these trays, this orange pad is a heating pad, and what it does is it heats the bottom of these trays up. Now you say it's freezing in here, but it's going to be 125 degrees. And understand the outside of it is going to be freezing, but the trays themselves are going to be warmed, so they're going to come above freezing. And we'll explain all that. Then your last setting is your extra dry time. Now, standard or the factory setting is going to be 2 hours. Now, I always do 10 hours for two purposes. One, it makes sure that all the moisture is out. Now, you can go through the process like a lot of people do. They weigh their trays after a certain amount of time, and then they'll run it another hour, and they'll see if the trays have got any lighter, and if they do, they know it's taking out more moisture. I just set mine at 10. I'm one of these set it and forget it type people. I don't want to be, I'm using a freeze dryer so I can process food without having to watch it. Now, those of you that do canning at home, and you know how that is, say you're going to do potatoes and you're going to can them, you got to sit there on your pressure canner. You have to wait for your pressure to come up to 10 pounds, and you have to watch it for 40 minutes, because the heat variance can, depending on your canner, can raise that above that pressure, or it can fall off. So you got to watch it and maintain it. With the freeze dryer, you don't have to do that. Now we're going to exit out of here. We're going to leave everything the same, so we're just going to cancel that. Now, after this point, what we're going to do, and we'll go to our other machine here, we're going to start the process. When we hit start, what it does is it starts counting down, and this number up here, it's counting down now. Once it runs for 15 minutes, and this one has already went through, it comes to this point to where it says continue. Okay, when it comes to freeze drying plums, and you got a big excess, it's easy enough just to cut around the pit, cut them up, fill the trays. Now what we're going to do is we're going to pre-freeze these. We've got a pretty good sized freezer here. And we've got the top rack empty, and we're just going to let them cool them down real good and freeze them, because it's a lot more efficient, and the time is less when it's done this way. Now that we've got our plums pre-frozen in here, which greatly speeds up the process, we're going to take these and we're going to put them in the freeze dryer. Okay, once you've loaded your freeze dryer, this is going to be a simple process. We're going to close the door. We have a valve here that closes off the air chamber. So once this gets to a certain point, it can pull a vacuum on it. And we're just going to hit continue. Now it says my room's a little warm, and it might be. I haven't adjusted my temperature this morning. And it's going to start the process of freezing. Now, while it's going through this process, I have a fan that I blow, and I point it towards the side of the machine that pulls in the cool air. And what this will do, and you can see it's just been a minute here, but it's now the room temperature is cooled down. And this is going to freeze faster. If your room temperature is too warm, you're going to have a problem that your the process is going to take longer. Okay, now we're at our other machine here. So we can talk about a few other functions while this is going through the process. Now, it's going to freeze until it gets to that temperature that you have it set, which is a minus 10. And then, like say, the time that you extend it, which this is going to be an hour after it gets to -10, it'll hit it once. It might bounce up and down, but once it hits -10, it's going to be an hour before it starts its process of pulling a vacuum on the chamber. Now, the stuff that I pulled out of my freezer is close to that temperature. So it's not quite. It's probably like a -7 or something like that. So it's going to take it just a little bit to get it colder, but it won't take it very long. Once it gets to that temperature, inside of here at the back, and you can see directly up there just under that orange pad, there's a sensor. And that's the sensor that picks up what the tray temperature is. And I always recommend putting the tray all the way back so the tray is actually touching that sensor. Now, I don't know how much difference it makes, but by design, they put it at the height to where it does touch that tray, so I believe that's where it should be. But anyway, once that hits that temperature of -10 and it goes for an hour, what's going to happen next is this vacuum pump is going to go on. Now, this vacuum pump on this one, I built a stand so that this exhaust air doesn't blow out onto the vacuum pump, and plus it doesn't get extra heat or block the flow of it when it's sitting there. So it works far better. And I did do a video on making one of these in the process, so if you want to go back, you can see that. But anyway, when it starts pulling a vacuum, it starts heating these trays. Now, if you understand physics and science, you'll understand that in a vacuum, it pulls out everything that's in there as far as oxygen and moisture and stuff like that. So as these trays heat up, it starts to soften those water molecules, and the vacuum pulls them off as a gas. Instead of like a dehydrator that it cooks them off, it actually pulls them off as a gas. That's why the texture on freeze-dried food is different than the texture on dehydrated food. Now, the period of time and how long you do it, the advantages of a freeze dryer over a dehydrator is that it can pull out more moisture. Now, it does change the texture of your food. To me, it's more powdery. Now, it will rehydrate just like dehydrated food. It takes a little while to rehydrate it if you're going to use it that way. In a lot of instances, we rehydrate it as we cook it. In fact, to me, certain things, the texture is better on freeze-dried foods like squash. For those of you that don't like squash because it's so mushy, especially like you can it or something like that, just cooking it when it's fresh, to me, it's watery and mushy. We cook it a little bit extra to get it a little bit more firmer. But when it's freeze-dried, it has, I wouldn't say leather, but it's more of a leathery texture. It's actually firmer. It stays together. It's not a mushy mess. And we rehydrate it while we cook it with a certain amount of moisture. And if you're cooking with butter or ghee, it actually soaks that up in it, so it's got more of a flavor. And the flavor is more intense. So if you like the flavor of it, it's not going to change the flavor. In fact, there's not anything that I've actually freeze-dried that the flavor doesn't taste much more intense. And a lot of things we just eat, I would say fresh, or we just eat straight from the jar or the Mylar bag, like plums, the flavor's more intense. They make a real good snacks and such as that. Or if you're going to put them in something, you can still put them in it. Say you want to make plum jelly, but maybe some years you have a really bumper crop and you have all these extras. You say, what am I going to do with these? Now you might just give them away, but when it comes a time that you don't have that supply of plums or whatever it might be, fruit's one of those things. A lot of times it just varies. You'll have a late frost or freeze, and it affects your crop set, stuff like that. So you want to have some that year. Well, with freeze dried, you'll have that because the length of time that it stores is a whole lot longer than any other preservation method. You can store in canning jars. The process, you use oxygen absorber in most everything, and we actually pull a vacuum on it too. That way the oxygen absorber doesn't have to deal with a bunch of oxygen that's in there at the time, and so it makes the absorber, let's say, more potent for a longer period of time. But that's the main advantage when it comes to having a freeze dryer, is the length of storage time. When you hear a lot of things, they'll tell you it can store 20, 30 years. And the reason for this is there's no moisture. The oxygen is removed from the container by the oxygen absorber. And so you don't have that problem with oxygen there, so bacteria can feed and it can spoil. So when you start talking about the cost, now these, in my first machine, I would say was a lemon. But now this machine is run for a year without having any problems. It could have problems tomorrow. But it right now, it's running good. There's no other cost, except maybe if you're going to add accessories or something, maybe if you're going to upgrade your pump to a premium pump or something like that. But other than that, there's no other cost involved in here. When you start taking and preserving it, yes, you do have the cost of oxygen absorbers and bags. But the same thing when you have the expense of new lids and rings. Now rings, if they're on most things, they'll last over and over. But the lids, now some people do reuse them. We reuse some of them, depending on what they are. But a lot of the lids, like if you're going to do acidic food, like pickling, tomatoes, stuff like that, they can eat away at the lid, so you don't want to reuse lids from those type of foods because the chances are they could fail with the next canning process, even though the rubber seal is still good, and if it's been a long time, the rubber seal could deteriorate, so that could be a problem. But with this and using the Mylar bags, and the expense isn't that expensive, especially if you buy in bigger quantities to do that, and sourcing is one of those things too. There's not a big expense, and I always say about 50 cents per container, and that's just a rough estimate. But these containers are really lightweight. They can be stored easily, and depending on your setup, you know, these little containers here work real well. You can adjust your shelves where they fit there, or you can just stack them on the shelves. It's hard to get maximum use out of them, but once you do this, these will last for a long time. Now, whenever you're going to be using these, you want to make sure that you use the oldest date first, so you have to kind of do a little bit of organization whenever you're doing this, and you need to watch your dates on your packages, so you'll use those, especially if you're starting to use newer things. But a lot of things, when you grow in season, just like yellow squash, it's warm weather, and depending on where you're at, you have a shorter warm weather season, so these can only be grown in a certain time. Or you might have insect pressure, so you might want to grow a lot of this right off so you can process it and put it up. Onions, now a lot of people say, oh, that stuff's cheap in the store, like onions, potatoes, stuff like that. But a lot of the stuff that you buy in the store it's been sprayed with certain pesticides or herbicides, and these residues stay in this food. Now, when you start listening to people, and I'm not a proponent for the Food and Drug Administration, because they're not regulating this stuff for our health. There's a lot of scientific studies, and I hate to use the word scientific because a lot of the information you find is not scientific. But there's been enough studies done that show that these residues are in there, and a lot of them are detrimental to our health and cancer causing and certain things like that. So if you wonder why your health isn't good, it's what you're putting in your body. I mean, when there's synthetic chemicals that are sprayed on plants and they're absorbed into the plants, and then you eat those plants, you've got these synthetics in you, and your body just isn't meant to deal with this stuff. There's other things you might can in a jar. I mean, not can, but store freeze-dried in a jar. Now these are freeze-dried roasted sweet potatoes, and there's two varieties. There's some purple ones, and then there's some of your standard orange varieties. But these, now a lot of people say, oh, they store for about 3-4 years in a jar. Now their storage time can be greatly increased. As long as it has a vacuum, it's kept away from light, and there's an oxygen absorber in there, these things can store for many years. So as far as they'll give a recommendation, and a lot of times their recommendation isn't really a recommendation for that. Now, we have sweet potatoes here that are stored in mylar, same types that's up here, but they're stored in mylar. Now, these will store for 20-30 years. And the thing about it is, you can grow a big crop of something one year, and then you've got room to grow all kind of other things the next year. So you can process this, and you can put it up. And that's the wonderful thing about a freeze dryer. You can schedule what crops you want to store, and grow those crops that year, and then the next year you don't have to grow them because you've got plenty on the shelf. And we do that sometimes. We plant more of one crop because we're in need of something, and then the next year we'll grow something else that we're going to be in need of. And we do a lot of canning on certain things, like maybe if you need pickles, you do a lot of cucumbers that year. If you need tomato sauces, paste, or juice or something like that, you do a lot of canning on those one year. So you can rotate your area when you're limited on the amount of space you have. And there's no limit to what you can preserve. Now this here is garlic. This was last year. We've done more this year. But we put it in mylar this year because we still have plenty of garlic from last year. And you can use it this way. Use your oldest up, and then once you get a mylar bag of the other, when you need to go to it, you can actually just take your mylar bag, dump it into a jar. But when you have that and you have an oxygen absorber in here, you have a vacuum pulled on it, this stuff will keep for years in here, as long as it doesn't get moisture. And there's not a limit. Now, maybe you want some Hatch green chilies or something, or some other type of pepper, maybe a lemon drop pepper. You can take and grow those that year, and then you can grow something else the other year. Maybe you want some Thai peppers. We just do these whole. And there's not a limit to what you can dry. Maybe you want some cayenne pepper, or maybe you want to make your own paprika powder. You know, all these things can be done, and they can be grown in a certain time, and then you have them available at other times. Now, this here is broccoli powder. If you want broccoli in, you can just freeze dry it and powder it up that way, or you can store it in Mylar bags as whole broccoli. Now, I know broccoli is one of those things that when I freeze dry it, the consistency doesn't come back afterwards, so that could be a factor. But there's other things. Maybe you want some cucumber chips. We use a little vinegar and a little seasoning, and we freeze dry these cucumbers so we can have a cucumber snack. Or these are real good in salads. They're kind of like a crouton, but you have that flavor from those. I wouldn't say it's a pickle, but it kind of gets it to a little bit of a pickle flavor. It's really nice. But there's so many options when you have a freeze dryer to how you can store long term. Cherry tomatoes. Now, this process, when we do these, we dehydrate them first, and the reason why that is it makes them shrink down. When you freeze dry cherry tomatoes, and we just cut them in half and season them just a little bit, but when you freeze dry them, they don't lose their size normally, very little. They'll keep that size so they don't store as many in there, and their texture is more powdery. So whenever we dehydrate these first and then we freeze dry them, we have a good texture to them, and we have a lot more intense flavor, and we can store a lot more in a smaller area. And that's another thing, as far as when you're freeze drying, you might want to still use your dehydrator for certain things, but the time that these will store is a really long time. So if you have a lot of extra cherry tomatoes and you want to process them up, now these here got a little dust on the top, that these were done in December of 22. So you can see, of course, we were still growing cherry tomatoes late in our season that year, and we had a bunch of extras, so we ended up freeze drying them. Now we're back to our peaches again, and we're not going to go through the whole process once these get finished. Now, a lot of people want to say, well, how long does it take for something, a particular item, to freeze dry? And we've talked about this in other videos. It really depends on the load that's in the vacuum chamber. If you have a really light load in the tray, it takes a lot less time. If you have a really heavy load, it takes a lot more time. If you're doing something with a whole lot of liquid, like milk or eggs or something like that, they're going to take a lot of time because there's a lot of liquid in there. But eggs and milk are two things that there's advantage to having as far as a freeze dryer for it, because during the summertime when it's warm, chickens lay good, and then once it cools off and it's they're having to devote more of their energy to heat, and plus maybe their molt and stuff like that, their production drops off. Well, when you can take and freeze dry some eggs, and we can put about 13 dozen, maybe to 15 dozen, depending on how big the chicken eggs are, in this freeze dryer at one time. And you can put these in Mylar and you can save them, or you can, if you're thinking you don't have a lot of chickens and you're going to use them up fairly quick, you can put these in a mason jar and keep them that way. But you don't have to worry about going to the store and buying something that you're producing when you have too many, and you got to either try to sell them, or you got to find a neighbor or a family member that needs eggs. You can actually take those eggs and preserve them, and you can have them later. And they reconstitute really well. And if the process is done right, once you reconstitute them, of course, you can't cook it like a sunny side up egg or something, because it is basically scrambled. But you can use that egg in any of your cooking, like your baking, or if you're going to make scrambled eggs, if you're going to make an omelet, all those kind of things. So it's a good way to preserve it. Now, if you're doing fresh milk, I'm going to recommend that you make sure that you get your cream off good, because fat is not something that does good in here. Now, I've talked mostly about fresh stuff, but you can do cooked stuff in here. I like to do all mine fresh. I don't like to spend some time cooking something up and then for a fast meal rehydrate it and use it that way. But you can do meat, like I say, as long as you render the fat out of it, because I've heard horror stories where whenever it starts taking that fat out, the whole inside lining, the tray holder, and all that kind of stuff will have a big mess that's got to be cleaned off it, and because the fat doesn't freeze dry good. So, but when we freeze dry milk, we freeze dry whole milk, and of course we don't have a cow. we could try to find access to fresh milk, but as far as our option now is store-bought milk. But we freeze dry it, so whenever we have freeze-dried milk, we don't have the no-fat or low-fat dried milk. We have freeze-dried whole milk, which makes a difference on the flavor and the fat that's in it. Your body needs a certain amount of that fat, so and we're not going to go into all that health stuff as far as that in. But you can have that option to preserve some of yours, say, especially if you're homesteading or you're on a farm and you have a milk cow, but you're having a lot of extra milk, and you're wanting another option of something to do with it, is freeze drying is that option. And a lot of people ask, what's the cost to run one of these things through the process? Now, I've heard $5, different amount. To me, and anybody that's worried about their health, is it doesn't matter. I mean, somebody goes to the doctor and they've got to pay for this $100, $200 prescription for whatever it is that's ailing them, and it's probably because they're eating toxic foods and stuff like that. I would much rather be healthy, not have to go to the doctor, and not worry about the expense of what it's costing. If you can afford it, then you can afford it. That's the way I look at it. And as far as the initial cost, yes, it's not cheap. This unit here, I think, is probably about $4,000 or somewhere around there. And there are smaller ones, so you can go with the smaller one. For us, and we're just two people, but especially if you have a bigger family, I would recommend the large machine. We have 2 of these, and they don't run every day, but they run a lot of time during harvest. So, and we would have to plan our runs of different things, just like we've got one of them running right now with plums. We have more plums to go in. We've got some herbs that's got to be harvested, so we've got that. Now, initially, we had, with our first one, we bought an extra set of trays, and then when this one here was sent to us by mistake, it didn't have trays. We had bought an upgraded pump for our other one, and so we used it with this one, and we did order us another set of trays, so we do have trays for both units, and we have a extra set. So while these are running, we can prepare something like these plums and pre-freeze them while the other loads are finishing, and then we can go ahead and have them ready to put in. So we just start this back up after it defrosts. And defrosting is another thing. Now, I probably will do a separate video on that as far as the process, because some of you might not understand the best way to do that. But for this video on whether you can justify it, you're going to have to make that decision. I tell people I don't see how you can't justify it. I understand it is expensive, but people throw away a lot more money than that on things, on their, say, toys or their hobbies or stuff like that. And gardening is kind of my hobby, so I guess instead of buying my big bass boat, buy a freeze dryer. And I definitely know that I'm getting a good value out of this. But anyway, I hope this little video helps you as far as when it comes to deciding whether or not you want a freeze dryer, and the big advantages to having one, because whenever we first originally did this, we could afford it, but I couldn't justify it. I said the amount of money that it cost, I said I just can't justify it. But on a lot of things that we freeze dry, like potatoes, potatoes are cheap in the store. Everybody says I'm not even growing potatoes, they're cheap, but do you know what's sprayed on them? Do you know the chemicals that's sprayed on them? Do you know that the cheapest potato is russet potato, which is the highest in starches and the worst potato for you? If you do your research, and it's probably best you don't. If you want to say that no, that won't justify growing your own, because I hear that so much. Like I say, onions are cheap and this and that. When you start trying to justify on price and you're not looking and comparing apples to apples as far as your homegrown high nutrient dense vegetables, and I'm talking about organically grown, I'm talking about heirloom and open pollinator varieties that have been tested, and the research has been done, and tell you that these vegetables are much better for you. Their nutrients are higher. There's no chemicals in them that you have to worry about. When you start coming to justification, that's what you need to look at. But anyway, thanks for watching. If you want to see more gardening videos or preserving, stuff like that, of course, hit that subscribe, hit the bell, select all, and give it a big thumbs up. Enjoy that gardening experience.